Alright, so we were looking at different levels of water availability or water content with different types of soil here, sand versus clay soils. And one thing to point out here is not only the difference in the available water here in this royal blue area between silt or clay loam versus sand, but also we want to define that available water, which is the difference between the field the water holding capacity of the soil at field capacity versus permanent wilting point. So all of this is going to be plant available water. Now, how this looks when we sort of take a look at what soil particles look like down here in this figure. Again, we're looking at plant available versus unavailable water in these diagrams here above and below. So this just shows us sort of diagrammatically what saturated soils look like here, where we have those individual soil particles completely saturated by the gravitational water as represented here, the darker blue in the figure. So all of this gravitational water then is unavailable to plants. Want to make that really clear. Number one, it has a high rate of hydraulic conductivity, and number two, it has a low oxygen content, which is a problem for roots. Okay. Then you see that as we drain the soil, we get to the field capacity level here, which again has a water potential of around negative 0.03 megapascals. Then we have our available water. So you can see that there's capillary pores are available or is present here with bound water surrounding the soil particles, and there's even a really tight region shown by the dotted line of what they're referring to here as hygroscopic water, and that's going to not be available after this wilting point, or what we were calling the permanent wilting point. But everything in between and the permanent wilting point, which is actually has a water potential of approximately negative 1.5 megapascals. So the range between negative 0.03 and negative 1.5 megapascals is all going to be available water, meaning plants can take up that water. What's going to vary though is the actual percentage of water in this soil when we're looking at sand versus silt versus clay. So we'll get to that here in just a minute. Let's talk a little bit about permanent wilting point. The permanent wilting point, just to define that here, basically is the percentage of water content where we measure that as the mass of water, again, over the dry soil mass times 100. So it's a percentage, but it's that percentage of water content where surface tension limits the chemical potential of water, or limits water potential. And so that occurs at the water potential, again, negative 1.5 megapascals. So over here on the left, we can see a diagram that helps illustrate surface tension between two soil particles. So here's a soil particle here, a soil particle here, and there's bound water here attracted to the surface of the soil particle by adhesive forces, or water or hydrogen bonding between water and the surface of the soil. And then we can see in this capillary space the collection of water, which is bound together by cohesion. And so there is this air water interface that occurs right here that I'm going to actually change the color of this pen so we can see this a little bit more clearly. There we go. And so as water is, evaporating, then there's a certain radius here. This is what we would call R. And as water evaporates, the radius actually gets, the radius of the meniscus, we're seeing a meniscus form here. The radius of the meniscus gets smaller and smaller. And so as the radius of the meniscus gets smaller, the bound water gets held more tightly to the surface of the soil particle. So surface tension in water is when the attraction between water molecules or between water and soil particles or soil surfaces, particles there, is greater than the attraction between water molecules and air. So that's the definition here, or what describes surface tension. There we go. In water. Okay. So this high degree or increasing degree of surface tension in soil is what we're seeing happening over here on this side of the water content gradient, which is also unavailable to plants. But it's unavailable to plants because the water is more attracted to the surfaces of soil particles than they are to air or to, and then there's not enough water sort of to move through the spaces in general. So as the surface tension increases in water, then that tension is what we're going to eventually here call the water potential. So the water potential is going to become increasingly and increasingly negative, or this water is under tension, basically. Okay, so if we move now into the next here. So what are the things, and we'll change this back to blue. What are the things that that decrease water availability and therefore affect water potential in soils? Let's say here. One of the things that would affect water availability is evaporation from soils. So we were just kind of seeing that happen in the above figure there, where the meniscus decreases, or the radius of the meniscus decreases. Another factor is just simply going to be root uptake. So the more root uptake that occurs of water, then the less water that's available in the soil, and that's going to decrease the water potential in soil. And another factor that in natural soils is not such a big deal, except here when we look at either a fertilized field or in hypersaline environments or saline environments, is salinity, or the solute concentration. And so this is only a factor really when we're looking in saline habitats, like we looked at in our in the paper that we looked at for halophytes. In fertilized soil is another example of where high solute concentration is going to decrease water availability. And with that same idea, over farming and desertification. So those are some extreme situations, but generally it's evaporation and root uptake that will decrease water availability over time. All right, so let's find out now what drives water movement. What drives water movement towards roots? And this kind of builds on some of the things that we talked about in Chapter 1, so you can kind of probably see one of these factors is going to be a water potential gradient out away from the root toward which is where the gradient will be high, and then it's decreasing as water moves towards the root. So water potential gradient from high to low. A second factor, so we're going to talk mostly about this water potential gradient and the factors that determine water potential in soils here. But another factor that we will talk about a little later is bulk flow. And there's a W. And then we talked about bulk flow just really generally, but this is where water flows from a high to low hydrostatic pressures, from high to low hydrostatic pressures. And hydrostatic pressures are pressures that either going to pull or push water. It's not a factor that's involved in transmembrane transport. So let's kind of focus more on the water potential gradient in the soil. And just to review some of the same concepts as we talked about before, just try to assign some water potential values here. So let's say we're out in the soil 10 millimeters away from the root. All right, so we want to know what a water potential is going to be at that distance to the root versus 1 millimeter away from the root. Then compare that to the root surface, so 1 millimeter closer, and then in the let's say in a root epidermal cell inside the cell itself. So we're looking at values out in the soil that might be, say, close to field capacity, where that would be negative 0.03 megapascals. And as we move closer to the soil, we're looking now at a soil water potential of maybe negative 0.1 megapascals. That's a pretty big drop. Let's say we get close to the surface here, and now we are at negative 3 megapascals, and then we're going to see another drop from the root surface to inside, so something that's less than negative 0.3 megapascals inside the cell. And remember, the cell can sort of maintain that lower water potential by lowering its osmotic potential, and it does. We talked about this before, where it does so by actively taking up nutrients, so that lowers the mole fraction of water inside the cell, thereby lowering basically the water potential inside the cell, keeping that water potential lower than in the soil, so that maintains the water potential gradient. Okay, now let's look at a question here that might be relevant in sort of non-stressed habitats out, say, in maybe in the soils of the eastern deciduous forests. Basically, we want to know what would happen to a plant if the soil water potential, we'll say soil water potential, near the root surface is negative 1.5 megapascals. Okay, we said that was the permanent wilting point in soils. So before you look at the next video recording or lecture recording, just try to think about what the answer to that question might be.